Hello, this is the 10-minute chess lesson, game 3 for beginners. I'll try to keep it to 10 minutes. As you can hear, the clock is starting me now. Because this is a complete game, we can do a quick review. This is for beginners. And if you've checked out the other videos, the first thing you should do as a beginner, try to understand tactical play. That'll give you an overall understanding of how chess is actually played and won. Your next step is to understand opening principles and actually apply that to your game, which will give you some guidance to starting the game. Then you understand your middle game strategies, tactics, and principles. And finally, when you have a noticeable advantage in the middle game, you'll be able to wrap the game up in the end game. The idea is that if you're ahead in material, exchange off all the pieces, queen a pawn, checkmate your opponent. If you have a better pawn structure, create a passed pawn, queen a pawn, checkmate your opponent. Avoid end games that leave two bishops against the lone king. You can force mate, but it takes forever. And you will almost never experience that as a developed player. Now, as a beginner who has not studied the concepts of chess, yeah, it can happen. And no, you won't be able to checkmate your opponent within a reasonable time. You want to avoid having two bishops against the lone king. You want to avoid having two knights against the lone king. You cannot force checkmate with two knights. You want to avoid having a bishop and a knight against a lone king. You cannot force checkmate with a bishop and knight. I have to check that one, but I'm pretty sure you can't. And I know for a fact you never want it to happen. You should know your end games. You should be able to win with the lone rook against the king. You can force checkmate, but you have to force them to the edge of the board. You can win with two rooks against the lone king. You can force checkmate. It's easier to force them to the edge of the board. You can actually do it in the center board, but who would want to? You can force checkmate with the queen against the lone king. Again, you force them to the edge of the board, you checkmate them there. The game that we are about to look at is actually not a beginner game. It's an intermediate game that I played against the computer. The computer was set for 1800, which is intermediate level, but there was also a time restraint. The time control was a 10-minute game, which for me is extremely fast. In competition, classical time control is 40 moves in 2 hours. Very often nowadays they will have a after time control, which will be sudden death in 30 minutes. I always get in trouble in that sudden death time control, but such is the way it is. Let's look at this game. I started the game with e4, which again is one of our basic beginner principles. My opponent, being the computer, I'll just refer to the computer as my opponent, responded with e6. This is the French defense, and again, like I mentioned, this is an intermediate game, so you'll see some somewhat advanced opening. As I talked about before, if your opponent will let you take total control of the center, take total control of the center. Made two moves there. Black responded by countering white's center with d5. This is the main variation of the French. I developed my knight and defended my pawn at e4. If he exchanges the pawn at e4, I'll be left with a piece in the center, which is what you want. Now here's a slight deviation from the main line. Of course, it's probably one of the variations. Many tournament players know all the names of their different variations. I don't even attempt to. All I know is hopefully how to respond correctly to any variation. Now, of course, that stops my bishop from pinning his knight if the knight should decide to come to f6. The computer recommends bishop to d3. What I actually played was I locked up the center and prevented his knight from coming to f6, which I was very comfortable with. But now I got to consider him placing his knight at e7 and then going to f5, which put more pressure on my d4 pawn, which is what the French defense is all about. Trying to advance this pawn to f5, advance this pawn to c5, advance the knight to c6, possibly bring the queen over to b6. And all black's efforts are going to try to be, black is going to try to focus on that d4 pawn, and of course white is going to try to defend it. There's a c5. I continue to develop my pieces. Now, bishop to d7. I'm not sure what the idea behind that would be. It is not in line with the main line of the French, so I'll just continue to play and try to develop my pieces. I'm threatening to take off the pawn at c5 and possibly exchange off my bad bishop. I think you'll remember from our explanation middle game play, if these pawns are on dark squares, then this is your bad bishop because its mobility is cut down. So I'm considering those exchanges and making d4 a strong square for possibly my knight or my queen. Black exchanged first, so I can exchange with my queen or my bishop. I selected the bishop because I don't want the queen to be harassed or attacked at d4. The computer recommends taking it off with my knight. I took it off with the bishop because I wanted support for e5. Now I have support with my bishop and with the knight. Of course, the other knight is threatening to take off my bishop pair. And without another pawn blocking that center, the player having that bishop pair might have a slight advantage. I moved against the knight, which really isn't even a pin. Attacks my bishop. I keep my bishop pair. Attacks again. I keep my bishop pair again. At this point, the computer analysis feels that black has a slight advantage. I think that advantage will be based on black having a pawn advantage in the center, which is the pawn at e6 and the pawn at d5. Black having the possibility to exchange off a knight for a bishop. And it looks like black is going to have space on the queen side of the board. Now black has a bishop pair. And the idea for black would be to open up the game and try to maximize the use of his bishop pair. Queen moves to the open file, or half open file really. I can also get my king out of the center. It looks like I'm going to need to either meet black on the queen side of the board or start to try to expand on the king side of the board. White does appear to be ahead in development, but I don't really have an option at many threats right now. He threatens to push my knight back. My knight goes to the edge of the board, looking at possibility of penetrating black's position either at b6 or at c5. Right now it's not possible. Black goes a pawn up. Now I've taken that central pawn, which leaves black with two pawns in the center, but also gives white some attacking chances if that king stays in the center of the board. Black needs to develop his bishop and knight quickly so he can get that king away from the center. White attacks the queen. Queen drops back. Okay, let's look at that. That probably wasn't black's best move. The computer recommends knight to b6, and I agree. Attacking the rook and attacking the light squared bishop.
3, 2, 1. Rest.
That's my timer telling me it might be time to start wrapping things up. And that's what I will do. But white probably should have played knight to b6, attack the rook and attack the bishop, take off the bishop, and black would no longer have an advantage of the bishop pair. What I actually did at this point was attack the queen, so I would have the pin in the center of the board. Queen saves herself. Now I can no longer go knight to b6 because the queen covers. I have no idea why I wanted to go queen to f3. I think it's so that I can pull my rook at a1 over to d1 and be on the same file as the dark squared queen. Black starts developing his king side. I bring my other rook to the center. And actually, white's development looks good, but it costs him the pawn to do. And there's no breakthroughs right now. I'm trying to open up another file, so maybe I can shift my rooks over there. Black castles, and according to the computer, black has a somewhat significant advantage. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that white has lost both of his center pawns and can no longer break through to black's position. Now black is giving back one of the pawns. Of course, he can capture it again, but he chose to play in the center of the board with the knight. I'm trying to get the black knight out of the center of the board. So he'll either have to exchange off that knight or allow my knight to be in the center of the board as well. He decided to exchange it off. His queen is now on an open file where my rook really can't attack it right now because I would lose the knight. The white's light squared bishop was just running into those two central pawns, so I wanted it on a better diagonal. Now it covers the b1 to h7 diagonal. Black attacks the pawn at b2. White does not cover the pawn at b2, and this is why it's in the beginner section. Very often you'll make an attack, your opponent won't cover it, you assume, well, he didn't see that, I can win a pawn. And that's exactly what the computer simulated. If you don't pay attention to your opponent's actions, this is what can occur. Black could have defended that mate threat, but he was too busy looking at a material advantage. And that's our game. Checkmate. Again, this was a training game, so a lot of the moves were quality moves, maybe slightly beyond the understanding of a beginner. But the thing that you definitely can understand is those last two moves. Black should have recognized the mate threat and not just been pawn grabbing, as we often refer to it. Okay, that's the 10-minute lesson that, of course, went slightly over, but que sera, sera. Okay, hope this helps, and we'll try it again next time. Bye for now.